The radio crackled with static, then silence. Command had stopped answering 20 minutes ago. That's when Lieutenant Maya Reeves knew the men on the ground were already considered ghosts. The valley had swallowed them whole. 12 Marines pinned in a ravine so deep the satellites couldn't get a clear image, so remote the nearest QRF was 40 minutes out. 40 minutes they didn't have. The Taliban had them bracketed, mortar teams walking fire closer with each explosion. Dust and smoke rose in columns visible from 18,000 feet, where the mission coordinator circled in an MC-130, voice tight, with the kind of calm that meant everything had already gone wrong. They'd sent 2 Apache gunships in first. Both turned back after taking heavy ground fire, rotors chewed by tracers that lit the canyon walls like fireflies. Then a Reaper drone which lasted 6 minutes before a MANPAD turned it into scrap metal tumbling through thin mountain air. The forward air controller on the ground, his voice hoarse and breaking, stopped requesting support, started saying goodbyes instead, told his wife's name to the static. Command had gone quiet because there was nothing left to say. The math didn't work. The valley was a kill box, a natural funnel with peaks on 3 sides and a single choke point the enemy had locked down with everything they had. That's when the A-10 Thunderbolt II appeared on approach, unannounced, squawking a code that made the mission coordinator's blood pressure spike. It wasn't assigned to this operation. Wasn't even supposed to be in country for another 72 hours. But there it was, descending through cloud cover like some iron angel nobody had prayed for, its silhouette unmistakable. Those straight wings, the engines mounted high on the fuselage, the nose that looked like it was designed to headbutt mountains. Unidentified Warthog, this is Overwatch 6. You are not cleared for this AO, repeat, not cleared. RTB immediately. The controller's voice carried the edge of someone watching a funeral procession crash into traffic. The A-10 didn't respond, just kept descending, dropping through 12,000 feet, then 10, then 8. Too low, dangerously low. The kind of altitude where the mountains stopped being scenery and became obstacles you could taste. When the pilot finally keyed the mic, her voice was steady, almost bored. Overwatch 6, call sign Ironside. I've got 12 friendlies who need a door opened. Recommend you get comfortable. Nobody in the command net recognized the call sign. Nobody knew who she was. But in 90 seconds, that wouldn't matter. In 90 seconds, the entire valley would be on fire, and Maya Ironside, Reeves would become the story they'd tell when they needed to remember what impossible looked like. Maya had flown the A-10 for 6 years, but the Air Force had spent 5 of those trying to convince her she belonged somewhere else. Transport duty, training command, maybe a desk where her degree in aeronautical engineering could shine without making the older pilots uncomfortable. They smiled when they said it, used words like opportunity and career trajectory, but she could read the subtext carved into their expressions. The Warthog was a gunfighter's plane, a close air support beast that required a certain kind of recklessness, and the brass didn't think she had it. Too calculated, they said. Too by the book. She'd graduated top of her flight school class, logged more simulator hours than anyone in her cohort, and still drew assignments that kept her away from the sharp end. Her call sign wasn't even supposed to stick. Ironside came from a training incident where she'd nursed a hydraulics failure bird back to base, limping through the sky on manual controls while her instructor puked into his helmet. Another pilot joked she had an iron stomach, an iron will, and an iron ass for sitting through that much turbulence. The name followed her like a shadow. She wore it quietly, never mentioned it in briefings, but it was stitched into her helmet cover, printed on the placard beneath her cockpit. Afghanistan was supposed to be different, a deployment where capability mattered more than politics, but even here she flew the dull missions, overwatch for convoys, presence patrols over green zones where nothing ever happened. Her squadron leader, a major with 30 years and a chip on his shoulder the size of Nevada, kept her on a leash. Not because you can't handle it, Reeves, he'd said once, not meeting her eyes, but because we've got guys with more experience in contested airspace. The guys with more experience had half her flight hours and twice her incident reports, but she didn't argue. You didn't win fights about perception. Until the morning she was running a maintenance check flight, solo, engines humming at altitude when the distress call bled through her radio. Encrypted channel priority 1. Marines down. Rescue assets turned back. She pulled the mission brief on her data link, saw the valley coordinates, saw the SAM threats and the terrain profile that looked like God had taken a knife to the earth. Then she saw the time on target estimates for the next available CAS bird. 47 minutes. She checked her fuel, checked her ammunition load, still carrying training rounds from the morning drill, but the GAU-8 didn't care what you fed it. Checked the distance. Then she banked south and pushed the throttles forward without asking permission. The descent was surgical. Maya kept the Warthog low, hugging ridgelines, using the terrain to mask her approach. The A-10 wasn't fast, but it was sneaky when you flew it right. Titanium bathtub around the cockpit. Engines mounted high enough that infrared seekers had to work for a lock. She could hear the radio chatter intensifying as she closed distance, the ground controller's voice cracking under the weight of commands nobody could execute. Overwatch 6, we need fire support now. They're inside 100 meters. I've got wounded who can't move. Another voice cut in, older, resigned. Overwatch, this is Chaos 1 actual, cease requests. We're going to dig in and buy time. Tell them we tried. The Major, accepting the math. Maya keyed her mic. Chaos 1 actual, Ironside inbound your position. 30 seconds. Mark your lines with IR strobes and get your heads down. Silence, then, Ironside, say again your call sign. Ironside. And I'm already committed, so light up your friendlies before I turn the whole valley into a parking lot. She crested the ridge at 400 feet, and the world opened into chaos. The ravine was narrower than the map suggested, walls of shale and scrub pine rising like the ribs of some ancient beast. Smoke pillared from where mortars had chewed the earth. She could see the Marines now, tiny figures pressed into a crescent of dirt and rock, their position marked by infrared glows only her helmet display could read. And beyond them, scattered across the slopes, muzzle flashes. Dozens. They'd walked into a prepared ambush, and now the enemy was closing for the kill. She activated her targeting pod, let the computer paint the picture. Then she thumbed the weapons selector to the GAU-8, that beautiful 7-barrel rotary cannon slung beneath her nose like the tongue of a dragon. Ironside engaged. The gun fired and the valley screamed. 70 rounds per second, each one a depleted uranium dart moving faster than sound, chewing through rock and flesh, and the illusion that the enemy had ever been safe. She walked the fire across the western slope, stitching a line of destruction that sent bodies tumbling and survivors scrambling. The noise alone was apocalyptic, a sound like the sky tearing open, a mechanical roar that drowned out every other sensation. The A-10 shuddered, slowed midair from the recoil, and Maya compensated without thinking, her hands moving through the controls like a pianist who'd played the song 1,000 times. The first pass bought seconds, not safety. Maya pulled up hard, fighting gravity and momentum, banking into a climb that took her over the eastern ridge just as an RPG streaked past her canopy, close enough she could see the vapor trail. Her heart didn't even spike. She'd expected it. The enemy had her now, knew she was coming back and they'd be ready. That was fine. She was ready too. She keyed the command net. Overwatch 6 Ironside. I've got their attention. Recommend you get a CASEVAC moving before I run out of bullets. The mission coordinator's voice crackled back, disbelief shading into something else. Ironside, you're not authorized. I'm also not leaving. She cut him off, already lining up her second run. This time she came in lower, treetop level, the Warthog's landing gear almost brushing the pines. The enemy had repositioned, spreading out, trying to make themselves harder targets. Smart, but they'd forgotten she wasn't here to play fair. She toggled the Maverick missiles, let the seeker heads lock onto heat signatures clustered near the canyon mouth. 2 launches, two trails of white exhaust, two impacts that turned cover into craters. Then she was back on the gun, hammering the slopes with fire so concentrated it looked like a solid beam of light, a laser made of hate and tungsten. The Marines on the ground weren't cheering. They were too busy pulling their wounded back, scrambling for better positions. But she could hear their radio discipline sharpening, voices steadying. They had hope again. That's all she needed to give them. Her weapons officer, a phantom who existed only in her training, would have told her to conserve ammunition, to manage her loadout for sustainability. But Maya had done the math before she dove in. She wasn't here for sustainability. She was here to buy time measured in heartbeats, to hold the door open long enough for the living to walk through it. If that meant going Winchester, flying home on fumes and prayers, so be it. She pulled into another climb, this time shallower, spiraling around the valley like a shark circling prey. Her eyes scanned the ridgelines, looking for movement, for the glint of optics, for anything that might put rounds on her Marines. There, northern slope, a team moving to flank. She nosed over, dove, fired. 3 seconds of gun, enough to send them scattering. Then she was climbing again, breathing hard, sweat stinging her eyes despite the cockpit's climate control. The third pass was when they got brave, or desperate. A technical with a mounted gun rolled out from behind a rock outcropping, its barrel swinging toward the Marines. Maya saw it and adjusted midair, less than a second to react. She fired, held the trigger down, and the technical disintegrated, truck and gunner and the ground beneath them all erased in a hailstorm of depleted uranium. The gun barrel glowed orange in her targeting display, overheating warnings flashing. She ignored them. The GAU-8 was built for this, designed to fire until physics itself started complaining. Then the call came through, the one she'd been waiting for. Ironside, Chaos 1 actual. CASCVAC is inbound, 2 minutes out. We're consolidating for extract. 2 minutes. She could do 2 minutes. She had maybe 400 rounds left, enough for another good gun run or 2 partial ones. The enemy knew it too. They were pulling back, dragging their dead, trying to break contact before the helicopters arrived. Some of them were smart. Most of them were just terrified because they'd realized the thing in the sky wasn't leaving, wasn't running out of ammunition, wasn't going to stop until they were all gone or the Marines were safe. Maya gave them one more pass, not to kill but to remind. She came in low and loud, the Warthog's engines howling, the gun spinning up but not firing, a show of force, a promise. They scattered like insects and she pulled up into a wide orbit, watching the valley stabilize beneath her. The helicopters came in fast, Blackhawks with door gunners scanning the ridges, crew chiefs yelling coordinates. The Marines moved like they'd rehearsed it, wounded first, then the able-bodied providing cover. Maya stayed high, circling, her fuel gauge creeping toward red. She didn't care. She'd siphon fuel from a goat if it meant seeing this through. Ironside, Chaos 1 actual, we're up, all personnel accounted for. His voice was different now, steadier, younger somehow, like he'd remembered what it felt like to win. Copy that, Chaos. Get home safe. She banked west, away from the valley, toward the setting sun and the base that would be expecting her arrival with a lot of questions. Her hands were trembling now, adrenaline finally catching up. She let them shake. It didn't matter. She'd done it. 12 men who were supposed to die were flying home instead. Landing was supposed to be the easy part. Maya brought the A-10 down on fumes, engines coughing, hydraulics groaning, the kind of landing that made crew chiefs wince and pray. She taxied to her hardstand, shut down the systems, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the silence. Her helmet felt too heavy. Her flight suit was soaked through. She popped the canopy, climbed down the ladder, and found a crowd waiting. The maintenance chief took one look at the Warthog and swore softly. The gun barrel was scorched black, the airframe pocked with small arms fire she hadn't even noticed. One of the Mavericks had failed to eject cleanly, leaving a scorch mark on the hardpoint. The landing gear struts had stress fractures. It was a miracle she'd made it back. Lieutenant Reeves. The voice came from behind her, sharp and formal. She turned and saw her squadron commander, the major who'd kept her on a leash for 6 months. His face was unreadable, jaw tight, eyes hard. Behind him stood a colonel she didn't recognize, stars on his collar, arms crossed. "Sir," she snapped a salute, waiting for the hammer to fall. The major stared at her for 5 seconds that felt like years. Then he said, "You disobeyed direct orders, endangered a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and inserted yourself into an unsanctioned combat operation." "Yes, sir. 12 Marines are alive because of it." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The major's expression cracked, just a little, the corner of his mouth twitching. "The colonel wants to debrief you. I suggest you tell him everything." The debrief lasted 4 hours. They went through every radio call, every weapons release, every second of the engagement. Maya answered every question with precision, never embellishing, never downplaying. The colonel listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he set his pen down and leaned back. "Lieutenant Reeves, what you did today was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. I haven't decided which." "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "Does it matter? They're alive." The colonel smiled, just a flicker. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He stood and she stood with him. "You're grounded pending an investigation. Standard procedure, but off the record. That valley would be a graveyard if not for you. Remember that when the paperwork starts." The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, Maya became a ghost on base. Pilots who used to ignore her now watched her walk past, whispering. Some of them looked at her with something like respect. Others with resentment because she'd broken the unspoken rule. She'd made them look slow. The Marines she'd saved sent a unit coin, engraved with her call sign and the date. She kept it in her pocket, rubbed smooth by her thumb during the long hours of waiting. The brass cleared her eventually, citing exceptional circumstances and tactical initiative. The language was bureaucratic, bloodless, but the subtext was clear. They couldn't punish her without looking like cowards. So instead, they promoted her. Captain Reeves now, with orders to lead a flight of 4 A-10s on a rotation that would take her to every hot zone in theater. Her first mission as flight lead was an overwatch for a supply convoy. Routine. Boring. She flew it like every other sortie, checklist perfect, comms professional, eyes scanning for threats that never materialized. But when they returned to base, one of her wingmen, a lieutenant with 2 years in the cockpit and an ego to match, caught her on the tarmac. "Captain," he hesitated like he wasn't sure what he wanted to say. "That valley, I read the after-action. What you did, that's not normal, right? I mean, that's not how we're supposed to do it." Maya looked at him, saw herself 6 months ago, eager and uncertain and desperate to prove she belonged. "No," she said. "It's not normal, but sometimes normal gets people killed. You do what the mission requires and you live with the consequences. That's the job." He nodded slowly, chewing on that. Then he saluted and walked away. She watched him go, wondering if he'd understand one day, or if he'd be lucky enough never to find out. That night, alone in her quarters, she pulled out the coin and studied it. The engraving was simple: Ironside, the valley, 12 souls. She ran her thumb over the words, feeling the weight of them. 12 men who would grow old, have families, tell stories about the day they should have died but didn't. All because she'd ignored the rules, trusted her training, and refused to let math decide who lived. She put the coin back in her pocket and lay down. Tomorrow there would be another mission, another set of coordinates, another chance to prove that the impossible was just a matter of will. Word spread the way it always does in the military, through bars and chow halls, and encrypted chat channels where pilots compared scars. The story of Ironside and the valley grew with each retelling, details sharpening or softening depending on who was talking. Some versions made her 10 feet tall and bulletproof. Others focused on the technical perfection, the way she'd flown the A-10 like it was an extension of her nervous system. The Marines who'd been there didn't talk much, but when they did, their eyes went distant. remembering the sound of that gun and the feeling of salvation arriving on titanium wings. Maya didn't pay attention to the rumors. She flew her missions, trained her wingmen, and kept her head down. But the Air Force noticed. They started assigning her the hard calls, the ops where intel was sketchy, where the terrain was hostile, where the margin for error was measured in seconds. She never complained, never asked for easier assignments, just strapped in, fired up the engines, and went to work. Her reputation became a weapon in itself. Enemy fighters learned to recognize the A-10 silhouette, and the sound of its gun started breaking contact when they heard it. Friendly ground forces requested her by name, wanted Ironside on station when they pushed into contested territory. She became the standard, the measuring stick every other CAS pilot was judged against. But the cost was invisible, paid in increments too small to notice. The nightmares where she missed, where the gun jammed, where 12 men died screaming her name. The hypervigilance that made her check her six even in the chow line. The way her hands shook after missions, a tremor she hid by keeping them busy. Nobody talked about that part. Nobody wanted to admit that being exceptional meant carrying weight that never got lighter. Her flight surgeon noticed during a routine physical. "Captain, when's the last time you took leave?" Maya had to think about it. Before deployment. "That was 9 months ago." "I've been busy." The surgeon, a major with kind eyes and a bullshit detector honed over 20 years, set his clipboard down. "You're burning out, I can see it. Hell, anyone paying attention can see it. Take 2 weeks. Go somewhere with a beach. Sleep past 0600. Remember what it's like to be a person instead of a call sign." She almost argued, almost said the squadron needed her, that there were missions only she could fly. But she looked at the major and saw the exhaustion reflected back at her, and she realized he was right. She was running on fumes. The leave felt wrong at first. Maya spent 3 days in Dubai, starring at a hotel pool and feeling like an imposter. Everyone around her was on vacation, laughing, drinking cocktails with umbrellas, living lives that didn't involve calculating weapons loads and terminal ballistics. She tried to relax, tried to read a book, but her mind kept drifting back to the cockpit, to the weight of the stick and the glow of the HUD. On the 4th day, she met another pilot at the hotel bar. Air Force, C-17 driver, older, graying at the temples. They got to talking the way pilots do, swapping stories without names or details, skirting the edges of classified without crossing lines. He told her about a cargo run where he'd flown into a sandstorm so thick he couldn't see his wingtips. She told him about a mission where she'd run out of ammunition and used her jet wash to scatter insurgents. "You're Ironside," he said suddenly, recognition dawning. "The Valley, Jesus, that was you." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He bought her a drink, raised his glass. "To doing the impossible." She clinked glasses but didn't drink, just stared into the amber liquid. "It's not impossible," she said quietly. "It's just expensive, and somebody always pays the bill." The C-17 pilot didn't have an answer for that. They finished their drinks in silence, two people who understood that the sky gave as much as it took, and you never really knew which until it was too late. The rest of her leave passed in a blur. She flew home to Oregon, saw her parents, pretended everything was fine. Her mother noticed the shadows under her eyes, the way she startled at loud noises but didn't push. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, understood without being told. He hugged her once, held on longer than usual, and said, "You're doing good work, Maya. Don't let them convince you otherwise." She flew back to Afghanistan feeling hollower than when she'd left, but more certain. This was who she was now, Ironside. The pilot who didn't quit, who didn't turn back, who flew into hell because someone had to. The cost was hers to carry, and she'd bear it until the weight finally crushed her or the war ended, whichever came first. The squadron threw her a party when she returned, unofficial and loud, held in a hangar after hours with smuggled beer and a grill someone had bartered from the army. Maya didn't want to go, but her wingmen dragged her anyway, insisting she needed to celebrate surviving leave without getting soft. She stood on the periphery, nursing a warm beer, watching her pilots laugh and argue and tell lies about their missions. Then the Marines arrived, 12 of them led by the major she'd pulled out of the valley. They walked in like they owned the place, and the hangar went quiet. The major scanned the crowd, locked eyes with Maya, and crossed the space in 6 strides. "Captain Reeves," he held out his hand. She took it, felt the calluses and the grip that could crush stone. "My men wanted to meet the pilot who saved their asses. Hope you don't mind." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. The Marines formed a loose circle around her, and one by one they shook her hand, said thanks, told her their names. Some of them were kids, barely old enough to shave. Others were grizzled and scarred, veterans of a dozen deployments. They all looked at her the same way, like she was a miracle they hadn't expected and didn't quite believe. The major was last. He pulled out a challenge coin, worn smooth with age, and pressed it into her palm. "This belonged to my platoon sergeant. He carried it through Fallujah, Sangin, and every other hellhole we've been sent to. He would have wanted you to have it." "Sir, I can't." "You can and you will, because he's alive to give it to me and I'm alive to give it to you. That's how it works, Captain. We carry each other." He stepped back, snapped a salute that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with respect. The other Marines followed suit. Maya returned the salute, her throat tight, her eyes burning. She'd spent 6 years trying to prove she belonged, and in one moment, surrounded by men who owed her their lives, she finally believed it. The party went late. The Marines drank with the pilots, shared stories, built the kind of bond that only forms in places where death is an occupational hazard. Maya stayed until the end, laughing more than she had in months, feeling the weight lift just enough to breathe. When she finally made it back to her quarters, she set both coins on her nightstand, the one from the Marines and the one from the platoon sergeant, and stared at them until sleep came. The months blurred together after that. Maya flew mission after mission, each one a variation on the same theme: ground forces in trouble, enemy closing in, Ironside inbound to even the odds. She became the pilot command called when everything had gone wrong, the last-ditch option that somehow always worked. Her kill count climbed into the dozens, each one a bureaucratic tally that meant nothing compared to the faces she'd saved. But the war was winding down. Drawdown orders came through, bases closing, squadrons rotating home. Maya's unit was slated to return stateside in 6 weeks, and the knowledge sat in her gut like a stone. She didn't know how to be a peacetime pilot, didn't know who she was without the missions, without the urgency, without the weight. Her final combat sortie came on a morning that started like any other. Routine patrol over a sector that had been quiet for months. She flew with 2 wingmen, cruising at 10,000 feet, watching the mountain slide past beneath her wings. The radio was calm, almost boring until it wasn't. "Ironside over Watch 6. We've got troops in contact, grid follows." The coordinates appeared on her data link, a position 20 miles south. Not her patrol area, not her problem, but she banked anyway, her wingmen following without question. The situation was bad but not catastrophic. A convoy ambushed, 2 vehicles disabled, enemy fighters in the hills but not overwhelming. The kind of fight that could go either way depending on who blinked first. Maya arrived overhead, assessed the battlefield, and keyed her mic. "Ground element, Ironside. Playtime complete, ready for tasking." The convoy commander sounded young, voice tight with stress. "Ironside, we've got a casualty who needs CASCVAC, but we can't get a bird in until those hills are clear. Can you suppress?" "Roger, heads down." She dove, lined up her first pass, and let the gun sing. The enemy scattered, broke contact, retreated into caves and crevices where she couldn't follow. She circled, waited, watched them try to regroup. Then she hit them again, harder, walking fire across the slopes until the hillside looked like the surface of the moon. 20 minutes later, the CASCVAC lifted off with the wounded. The convoy limped toward base. Maya stayed on station until they were clear, burning fuel she didn't need to burn, making sure nothing else went wrong. When she finally turned for home, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. It was the last time she'd fire her gun in anger. The last time she'd hear that sound, that beautiful, terrible roar. The homecoming was surreal. Crowds at the airfield, families crying and cheering, politicians shaking hands and taking photos. Maya stood on the tarmac in her dress uniform, medals gleaming, feeling like an actor in someone else's story. They gave speeches about service and sacrifice, used words like hero and warrior, and she nodded in the right places but didn't hear any of it. Her mind was still in the mountains, still circling the valley, still holding the door open for people who needed her. The transition to peacetime flying was harder than she'd expected. Training missions felt hollow, exercises that everyone knew were simulations. She flew aggressor roles, played the enemy for younger pilots to practice against, and tried to care about scores and metrics that didn't involve life and death. Her evaluations were perfect, her performance flawless, but she felt like a ghost haunting her own career. Then the Air Force offered her a way out. Not a discharge, but a different role. Instructor pilot at Nellie's, teaching the next generation of Warthog drivers how to survive, how to think, how to do the impossible when the situation demanded it. She almost said no, almost walked away entirely because she couldn't imagine standing in a classroom talking about things she used to do instead of doing them. But then she remembered the lieutenant who'd asked her about the valley, the uncertainty in his eyes, the need to understand. She remembered being that lieutenant once, desperate to prove herself, terrified of failing. And she realized that maybe this was the mission now. Not flying into danger but preparing others to face it. Not being Ironside but creating more pilots who could be. She accepted the position, packed her gear, said goodbye to her squadron, and flew to Nevada feeling like she was leaving a part of herself behind. Maybe she was. Maybe that's what transition meant, becoming someone new while honoring who you'd been. The first time she stood in front of a class of student pilots, she saw herself reflected in their faces. Eager and scared and hungry to prove they belonged. She didn't give them a speech, didn't try to inspire them with stories of her own heroics. Instead, she walked to the whiteboard and wrote 3 words: mission, capability, will. These are the only things that matter when everything goes wrong, she said. The mission is what needs doing. Capability is what you bring to the fight. Will is refusing to quit when the math says you should. Master those 3 things and you'll save lives. Fail them and people die. It's that simple and it's that hard. Let's get to work. Years passed. Maya taught hundreds of pilots, watched them graduate and deploy and return with their own stories. Some of them became legends in their own right. Others were competent, reliable, the backbone of the force. A few washed out, couldn't handle the pressure, and she never judged them for it. Not everyone was built for this. That was okay. She made captain, then major, then lieutenant colonel. The promotions felt inevitable, boxes checked on a form, but she wore the rank lightly. What mattered was the work, the students, the moments when a struggling pilot suddenly understood, when the pieces clicked and they transformed from technicians into warriors. Her story became part of the curriculum, the Valley taught as a case study in tactical decision-making and risk assessment. New instructors used her after-action report, broke down her choices, debated whether she'd been brilliant or lucky. Maya sat in on those classes sometimes, listening to people analyze her life like it was a mathematical proof. She never corrected them, never offered her own perspective. The truth was messy and emotional and impossible to quantify. Better to let them learn the sanitized version. But sometimes, late at night, she'd pull out those challenge coins and remember. Remember the weight of the stick, the scream of the gun, the sound of a Marine's voice steadying when he realized he wasn't going to die today. Remember what it felt like to be more than herself, to be the answer to someone's prayer. One afternoon, a student approached her after class. Young woman, sharp eyes, hungry for something Maya recognized. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "That mission, the valley, would you do it again? Knowing everything you know now, would you still dive in?" Maya thought about it, really thought. Thought about the nightmares, the cost, the weight she'd carried every day since. Thought about 12 men who got to grow old, who got to go home, who got to live because she'd refused to accept the math. "Every single time," she said. "And so would you if you're the pilot I think you are." The student nodded, something settling in her expression. She saluted and walked away, and Maya watched her go, seeing the future. Seeing the next generation of pilots who'd fly into the impossible and make it look easy. That's when she knew her mission wasn't over. It had just changed shape, become something slower and harder to measure but no less important. She was building a legacy now, one student at a time, one lesson at a time. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. She stood in the empty classroom, sunlight streaming through windows, dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time in years she felt at peace. Retirement came quietly, the way it does for officers who have spent decades in uniform. No grand ceremony, just a small gathering of colleagues and former students, a folded flag, a few speeches that tried and failed to capture what her service had meant. Maya stood at attention, accepted the honors, and thought about all the things she'd never say. About the weight and the cost and the nights she'd woken up screaming. About the joy of flight and the terrible beauty of being exactly where she was needed when it mattered most. She moved to Montana, bought a cabin near a small airstrip, and spent her mornings watching the sky. Sometimes she'd see contrails, military jets on training runs, and she'd track them out of habit, judging their altitude and speed and tactical positioning. She couldn't help it. The war was over, but the warrior remained. Former students visited occasionally, bringing stories and questions and bottles of whiskey. They'd sit on her porch and talk about missions and close calls and the way the A-10 handled in a dive. She'd listen more than she spoke, offering advice when asked, staying silent when they needed to work it through themselves. Some of them were instructors now, passing her lessons to a new generation. Others had left the Air Force, started families, built civilian lives. All of them carried pieces of her with them, lessons learned in classrooms and cockpits, wisdom earned in blood and adrenaline. One spring morning, 15 years after the valley, a convoy of motorcycles rolled up her driveway. 12 riders, older now, grayer, softer around the edges. The Marines. They'd made a pilgrimage, tracked her down, wanted to see the woman who'd saved their lives and never asked for anything in return. The major, retired now, a grandfather, climbed off his bike and pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than protocol allowed. "We came to say thank you," he said, "properly this time." They spent the day on her porch, drinking beer and trading stories. The Marines told her what they'd done with the years she'd given them, careers and marriages and children. One had become a teacher. Another ran a construction company. A third was a firefighter, still running toward danger because that's what she'd shown him was possible. They laughed about the absurdity of it, how a random Tuesday in Afghanistan had become the axis their lives pivoted on. "Do you ever think about it?" one of them asked. "The valley." "Every day," Maya said, simple, true. "Does it get easier?" She looked at him, saw the weight he carried, recognized it. "No, but you get stronger, and that's enough." They stayed until sunset, until the sky turned the color of fire and the mountains went purple with shadow. Then they mounted their bikes, saluted her one last time, and rode away, their engines fatting into the distance. Maya stood on her porch and watched them go, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Completion, the circle closed, the mission finally truly over. She went inside, poured herself a whiskey, and raised the glass to the empty room. To the pilots she'd trained and the lives she'd saved and the impossible things she'd made real. To the girl who'd wanted to fly and the woman who'd learned that flight was just the beginning. To Ironside, to the valley, to the door that stayed open when it should have slammed shut. She drank, and in the silence, she could hear the faint echo of a gun spinning up, the roar of engines, the sound of someone refusing to quit. It was memory and ghost and benediction, and it would stay with her until the day she finally stopped carrying it. But that day wasn't today. Today, she was alive, the sky was clear, and somewhere out there, pilots she'd trained were flying into danger with her lessons in their heads and her example in their hearts. That was legacy, that was enough, that was everything.